Welcome to the Revitalize My Church podcast, created to help churches navigate change and reorient to a new and healthy future. Here's the host of the show, Bart Blair.
Welcome to episode 35 of the Revitalize My Church podcast. My name is Bart Blair. It's my privilege to welcome you to another episode and to a new year. It's 2026, so Happy New Year to you. If you happen to be listening to this in real time as it is being released, it's right at the beginning of January 2026. And I'm hopeful that you are hopeful about the year of ministry that you have ahead. And I hope that you can look back on 2025 and see that it was a fruitful year of ministry for you. We've been producing this podcast since the summer of 2024 to help churches navigate change and reorient to a new, healthy, and fruitful future. Regardless of where your church is in the possibility of a revitalization season or a revisioning season or even a replanting season, we try to create content that we hope you can apply to your ministry and that it will bear fruit. That's really what we're hoping for, because we want your ministry to bear fruit. Just like we kicked off 2025, I'm going to kick off 2026 with some book recommendations. I'm a pretty voracious reader. I consume a lot of content. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I read a lot of books. In fact, I set a goal every year of reading 52 books, a book a week. I've never actually accomplished that goal. I think in 2016 or 2017, I got really close. I think I read 50 books that year. In 2025, I read 22 books, and I'm going to recommend to you 5 of the books that I read. One was a reread, sort of a reread. It was a re-release or a new edition of a book that I read about 12 years ago. I think I had one reread on my 2025 list. I've got one reread on my 2026 list. Now, you may not be a reader. You may not be a person who spends a lot of time reading. If you're not, I just want to encourage you to pick up one of these books. Maybe one of these books will have something of interest in it for you. I think that to be a great leader, you probably should be a reader. You need to be learning from other things that other people have experienced. And I've got a pretty wide variety of topics that these books cover. So maybe there'll be something here of interest to you. Maybe you can read it alone. Maybe you read it with your leadership team. Maybe you read it with your spouse or your ministry partner. Whatever that looks like, pick up a book and read a book. And maybe one of these recommendations that I'm going to be making for you will be something that you can add to your reading list in 2026. All right, so here we go. Here's my countdown. It's not really a countdown, but here's my list of 5 books that you should read in 2026. Well, the first book that I'm going to recommend to you this year is called The Discipleship Opportunity, written by Daniel M. Now, Daniel is a pastor. He actually is a pastor up in Edmonton, Canada. He's been back in Edmonton, I think, for a few years. He was living in the United States for quite a while, and his name may be familiar to you if you listened to, back in the day, the church... it was a church planting podcast with Ed Stetzer. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Maybe it's called the Church Planting Podcast, something of that nature. Ed Stetzer now has a podcast. I think it's called the Ed Stetzer Podcast. But Daniel M. used to actually be a co-host of a church planting podcast with Ed Stetzer. That's where I first became familiar with him. He is originally from Canada. He moved up to Edmonton to be the lead pastor, senior pastor at Beulah Baptist Church in Edmonton a few years ago. And he wrote this book called The Discipleship Opportunity. I picked it up and I loved it. I absolutely loved this book. The subtitle of the book is How Churches Can Equip the Saints to Do the Work of Ministry. It doesn't get more simple and straightforward than that, does it? And what I really appreciate about this book is that he doesn't just talk about the theological why of discipleship. He actually gives very practical hows. How to build systems and structures that actually work in real churches. One of my favorite quotes from the book, he says, I have found that every church has discipleship-related systems, but not every church has a discipleship pathway. Basically, what he's saying is that everything that we do is designed in some way, shape, or form to disciple people, but not everything tends to work together or congruently. And what he wants us to learn how to do is to build our entire ministry system so that every piece is developing people as disciples, because that's ultimately what we're called as the church to do, right? Is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Now, I've actually been doing some discipleship workshops and some training over the course of the last year. And I actually have hijacked quite a bit of content from this book. And it's been very exciting for me. Even in my own church plant, we're implementing some of the principles and things that I've learned from this book into what we're doing. And I'm really excited that we're actually going to be having Daniel M. on our show as a guest here in the upcoming months. We've already got a date scheduled to record that episode. And we'll be talking specifically about his book and the discipleship opportunity that you have in your church. So I hope that if you're in a place where you're trying to figure out how to build a better, more effective, more efficient discipleship pathway or discipleship system in your church, that you'll pick up a copy of The Discipleship Opportunity by Daniel M. The second book on my list of recommendations for 2026 is by Brandon J. O'Brien, and it is called The Strategically Small Church. Now, the title of that book, it probably got your attention. It got my attention when I heard Brandon on another podcast, and I was like, I got to check out this book. You know, we live in a culture where people naturally think that bigger is better, that bigger is always better. But bigger isn't always better. Bigger isn't always best. In fact, sometimes being strategically small or strategically smaller can actually help you make a greater impact in the community that you're in. A lot of it is perspective and a lot of it is contextual, right? The goal, the purpose of this podcast has never been about making smaller churches bigger, but to make smaller churches healthier. Now, I don't know any pastors who don't want to see their church grow. We all want to see our churches grow because growth is a sign that perhaps we're making new disciples and we're making a greater impact in our community, but not every pastor desires to pastor a large church. And I can resonate with that. I've been in large church, I've been in small church, and honestly, my wife and I prefer a smaller to normative sized church as opposed to a larger mega church. That's just our personal experience. And I'm sure that there are a lot of other people that are like that. And there are certainly a lot of pastors and church leaders who would say they don't really have a desire to pastor a mega church, but they do want to pastor a healthy, growing, vibrant church. A smaller church, when it's intentionally small or intentionally normative size, can be more intimate, can be more nimble, can certainly be authentic, and can still be influential in its community. One of the quotes from the book that I wrote down, Brandon says this. He says, a strategically small church is not a large church that hasn't grown yet. It's a church that has intentionally chosen its size because it believes that's the best way to accomplish its mission in its community. I think that will resonate with a lot of you. It's an interesting book. It was, I think it's an older book that he rewrote or edited and updated. I believe the book has been out for a while. I heard him on another podcast and I picked up the book. I thought it was really fantastic. So, if you're in a church that is a smaller church, sometimes that can be a little bit discouraging, but I think that there's a lot of encouragement that you can get from this book to think about how you can leverage the size of your church, if it is a smaller church, to make a greater impact in your community through your ministry. So that's my second book on the list of recommendations for 2026, The Strategically Small Church by Brandon J. O'Brien. The third book on my list of recommendations for 2026 is written by Tom Mercer, and the book is called 8 to 15. The subtitle, The World is Smaller Than You Think. Now, the title of this book certainly got my attention, and the topic is one that is near and dear to my heart. The topic is evangelism. It's reaching the people that God has already placed into your life. What does the title mean? Well, it means that there's pretty much everybody has a social circle, an oikos, so to speak, to use the Greek word from the Bible. Everyone has an oikos of about 8 to 15 people. There's about 8 to 15 people in your life, and every congregant in your church. They have the influence, the ability to influence in their faith journey. And what Tom does in this book is he helps us recognize that these close relational networks that we have, these close relational circles that we have, are our primary mission field for evangelism and disciple making. We can sometimes get so focused on programs and events and activities and reaching strangers in our community, right? We do this as church planters, as church revitalizers, as pastors. We want to go and reach all the people that we don't yet know. When in reality, whether your church has 10 people sitting in your services on Sunday morning or 110 people or 1,000 people, each of those people has a social relational network of about 8 to 15 people, many of whom don't yet know Jesus and desperately need to know Jesus. So what Tom does is he walks us through some practical, simple steps on how we can leverage the relationships that we already have, building more intentionality into those relationships, sharing our faith naturally, and to focus more on the relationships that we already have rather than looking for strangers to evangelize. And we'll start seeing our everyday world as a mission field. I think that this book is a powerful reorientation for believers because we sometimes, we miss our nose right on our face, right? The people that God has already brought into our lives, the oikos that we have. And that's the principle of the book here, is to look at that community that God has already brought into our lives, people who need to know him. So grab a copy of 8 to 15 by Tom Mercer. This might be something that you want to lead a small group through, or you can read as a team. And I think it'll really help you shape your evangelistic strategy for 2026 and beyond when you start thinking about your own oikos, the oikoses. I don't know if that's the proper word for that. Oikoses, the multiple oikos of all the people that are already a part of your church, and you'll make a greater impact evangelistically going forward. Anyway, 8 to 15 by Tom Mercer. The fourth book on my list of recommendations for 2026 is called The Plurality Principle by Dave Harvey. Now, you might be wondering why I'm holding up a copy of this book. Honestly, I don't buy paper books very much anymore. I read almost all of my books on Kindle, but I ran across this book and I was like, I wanted a paper copy. I wanted a paper copy because I wanted to highlight and write notes in it. I use the Kindle app highlighting stuff in there. You can highlight stuff. But it's not as easy to take notes. I picked up this book primarily because I am coaching several churches on their elder process. Like what is an elder in the church, and how does an elder team work together? This book has been so eye-opening and so helpful for me. If you are in a place where you're trying to figure out how your elder team can either be formed or work together better, I really, really recommend this book. It's called, the subtitle is How Your Church Can Be Healthier, Wiser, and More Resilient with Shared Leadership. A lot of people have ideas about how a plurality of elders ought to work together, how leadership and governance in church ought to work. I really think that Dave Harvey does a fantastic job of breaking down both biblical principles, but also sharing very, very practical examples of how things have played out in his own ministry and that of other churches. So really, man, I can't recommend this book more. I've reached out to Dave. I'm hopefully going to be able to get him as a guest on the show sometime in the near future to talk about this, because I think it is so, so helpful. If your church is struggling with really figuring out how your pastor works with elders, maybe you're trying to figure out how to raise up elders, maybe you're trying to figure out how all these roles need to work together, I really can't recommend this book more. The Plurality Principle, it's a little hard to say, The Plurality Principle by Dave Harvey. That's my fourth recommendation for your reading list in 2026. The fifth and final book in my list of recommended reads for 2026 is called Lead Like It Matters by Craig Groeschel. If you're not familiar with Craig Groeschel, he is the founding and lead pastor of Life Church, which is based out of Oklahoma, one of the largest and fastest growing churches in the country. Craig has written many books on both leadership and discipleship, spiritual walk type stuff. He has a podcast, which I believe is called the Craig Groeschel Leadership Podcast. Also really, really excellent content there. This is the only reread in my reads from 2025. I don't reread a lot of books, but this was a new updated edition of a book that I'd read about 10 years ago or so. The original title of the book was called It, not to be mistaken with the Stephen King book, It. What is it? You ever look at certain churches and ministries and go, man, that church, they have it. I can't really put my finger on what it is, but they seem to have it. They have momentum. They have creativity. They have resources. They're making an impact. And you look at those churches and you look at those ministries and you go, whatever it is that they have, I wish we had a little bit of it. And what Craig Groeschel lays down for us in this particular book is that it is not always a ministry model or a ministry style. A lot of the times it comes as a result of the leader and his gifting, developing his gifts, and leveraging those gifts to help the church go where the church needs to go. And sometimes it is obviously a blessing from the Holy Spirit, and that's not something that we can conjure up or something that we can manufacture. But as leaders, we can always be developing our skills to be better at the leadership that God has called us to. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know that one of our 5 big rocks of revitalization is leadership. It is really important that the lead pastor in a church, whether a revitalizing church or an established church or a church plant, can preach, is solid in God's word, and has a shepherd's heart, has the ability to shepherd their people. But leadership, it requires someone moving people from where they are to where they need to be, moving the church from where it is to where it needs to be. And I think as leaders, I said this at the beginning of the podcast, as we're reading and learning, there are leadership gifts that we can cultivate, that we can grow in, that we can get better at. And Craig Groeschel in this book lays down some things that I think are really, really helpful in terms of helping our churches be better, stronger, and healthier as a result of our own leadership and things that we're cultivating, things that we're working on. So I hope that if leadership, maybe that's an area in your ministry where you recognize that you've got some room for growth. Maybe there's some areas in your own leadership that you just need to get better at, leading volunteers, leading your team, leading your church to that new and preferred future where you want to be. I highly recommend that you pick this book up. Craig is not just one of the most gifted communicators and greatest leaders, but he's funny too. And so there's even some good humor in the book. Give you a few chuckles and a few good laughs and lots of very, very relatable stories. Sometimes you look at a church like Life Church and you go, wow, they've got, I don't know how many campuses, 30 or 40 campuses around the country and tens of thousands of people that attend. But man, the church wasn't always like that. They started in a garage. They've been through a lot of stuff to get where they are today. And even on the surface, when sometimes we're looking at it going, man, they seem to have it all together, he even confesses some things that he got wrong along the way. And I think that there's comfort in knowing that even as great a leader as he is and as successful as his ministry seems to be, not to contradict what I said earlier, that bigger is not always better, but his church is definitely big and they're definitely making an impact and they're definitely making lots of new disciples. And so there are some things that I think we can learn from Craig Groeschel, from his leadership experience, and certainly from this book to help us all lead our churches better and more effectively. So that's the fifth book on my list of recommendations for 2026, Lead Like It Matters by Craig Groeschel. Well, that does it for my 5 recommended reads for 2026. Hopefully at least one of those resonated with you and you will pick up a copy and work your way through it and be blessed, or maybe you'll read all 5. And if you have something that you've read recently that you'd like to recommend to me, shoot me an email. bart@assistcx.org is my email address. Love to hear from you. Love to know what you're reading, as I am already compiling my own personal reading list for 2026. And love to know what you're reading if you have a recommendation for me. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Revitalize My Church podcast. We do want to remind you that we release an episode on the 1st and the 15th of every month. And in order to make sure that you don't miss any future episodes, the best thing for you to do is subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. So if you're on Apple or Spotify or wherever that is, make sure that you subscribe so they get automatically uploaded or downloaded to your mobile device, to the app where you listen to them. And if you haven't ever left us a rating or review, we'd love for you to do that. You can do that on Apple, you can do it on Spotify or anywhere else that you listen to your podcast. That'll help get the word out to more people about this podcast, because we'd love to be able to bless more churches with the content that we're creating. Thanks again. Happy New Year.